Episode 10. The End of the Beginning. Once again, it would seem like we shall make a proper will mage of you yet, Eris complimented Rabineau coolly. Eris, Rabineau breathed. I could feel the stump underneath me. Yes, I know, she agreed. I felt your awareness begin to expand as you did so. Rabineau's brow furrowed. That's something you can feel. Of course, Eris answered. Once you know the difference, spotting those capable of doing so becomes rather easy. You'll begin to shine like the brightest candle in the candelabra. Rabineau's expression turned to a thoughtful frown. I'm not sure sticking out like that is the greatest idea. Well, Eris responded, it'll take you twice as long to figure out how to mask your power, so unless you want to stop making progress altogether, the only option for you is to march forward. As you understand more about will magic, you will be able to dampen your own outward expression of it. Until then, you will just have to deal with it. Can you, dampen your expression? Rabineau asked with curiosity. I have no need to, Eris said. My energies occupy an entirely different wavelength than human energies. One must be very advanced in will magic to be able to perceive my awareness, and honing in on it is an entirely different affair. That's something even Linrem has difficulty mastering. Precisely how I was able to stay hidden away in the chateau for so long. A different wavelength, huh? Rabineau asked thoughtfully. That's interesting. Interesting or not, Eris said, it is beside the point of today's lesson. Do other creatures also have different wavelengths? Rabineau asked, oblivious to what Eris said. Of course they do, Eris said, exasperated. But again, that is besides the... Eris cut off mid-sentence and immediately looked east, back towards the chateau. Eris? Rabineau asked tentatively, after she stared for several long moments of silence. Is everything okay? Silence, she hissed. She stared, wide-eyed, as the seconds dragged into minutes. We must go, she said, springing from the stump and running back towards the entrance. Now, Rabbit! Wait, Rabineau said, getting up to follow Eris. What's going... And then he felt it. It was like feeling the distant shock waves of two giants dueling. Massive energies most definitely clashed in battle. Rabineau felt the blood drain from his face. Eris, he shouted in alarm as he ran behind her. What is that? Eredin, she growled. He's finally come to the chateau. What? Rabineau shouted in disbelief. We have to. Eris stopped, dead in her tracks. Her hackles were raised and she stared east. No, she whispered. No, 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 no! Lynn! Rabineau and Eris came spilling out of the hidden tunnel leading to the pine grove and searched around frantically, looking for Gareth in the buggy. The old manservant had managed to turn the buggy around in the tight quarters and was now parked several feet away from where they had left him. Gareth sat in the driver's seat, reading a small book, which he sat down, appraising them quizzically as they appeared. Gareth, Eris said sharply as she bounded back to the buggy. We must go! Something is amiss at the chateau. She leapt into the back and stood, watching Rabineau hurry over. Quickly, Rabbit! No time to walk alongside! Get in! Just as Rabineau grabbed the top of the buggy, preparing to haul himself in, something strange happened. The very air itself shivered, visibly warping as if a great heat were simmering beneath it. In the eye of this distortion, a small ball of sky blue light appeared and began growing. Nobody moved. Rabineau clung to the side of the buggy, slack-jawed. Eris had her hackles raised once more and looked ready to tear out of there, and Gareth had turned in his seat, eyebrow raised quizzically. The ball of blue grew until it was the size of a pumpkin. It then split along the top, and the light flexed out into a great pair of wings, shimmering brilliantly in the low light around them. The ball of light sat for a long moment, hovering in the air, before it split open again. The second rupture, however, was a half-moon sliver that sliced the lower half. It almost appeared to be a mouth, a comparison made ever more arguable when it opened wide like a massive smile. Only, instead of bearing teeth, darkness clung to the space revealed by the gaping maw. From the darkness, something began to emerge, making Rabineau imagine a great tongue coming out to lick them. But it wasn't a tongue. It was a book. A massive, leather-bound book that looked ancient and impressive. It took several seconds for the book to fully emerge from the mouth of energy, and once it did, it slowly floated down to rest in the bed of the buggy. As soon as the book was set down, the mouth closed, returning to its faux grin. Then the mouth opened again, only this time it spoke. "Goodbye, my friends." The voice was ghastly and faded, as if coming from a great distance. But it was unmistakably Linrim's voice. The apparition shivered, quivering all along the edges, and then burst into brilliant sky-blue motes of light that floated down like dust all around them. Silence claimed the moment as all three of them stared at the book now lying in the buggy. Gareth was pale and looked stricken, and Eris looked like she was torn between crying and attacking the book. Rabineau only looked at the book in awe, amazed at what he had just witnessed. "What was that?" he asked breathlessly. "And what is that?" He looked up as he pointed at the book and saw the expressions on his companions' faces. He frowned and opened his mouth to ask more, but Eris spoke up, cutting him off. "That is Linrim's Book of Will," she said softly. "And that apparition can only mean one thing. Right, Gareth?" The old manservant nodded sadly, but said nothing. "What?" Rabineau asked, alarm edged into his voice. "What does it mean?" "It means Lin is dead, Rabineau." Her words cut to the quick, and all the pieces fell into place. The energies he had felt clashing, Eris's alarm and cries of Eridan coming to the chateau, it all made perfect sense. His master had clashed with his estranged son one last time, and lost. "That's why he sent us away," Rabineau said softly. Eris yowled sorrowfully into the air, a cry so mournful it pulled savagely at Rabineau's heart. When she finished, tears ran down her furry little face. Rabineau didn't know cats could cry. Perhaps it was just this cat. "I imagine you are right, Rabineau," she answered. "Lin likely felt his approach and didn't want us caught in the crossfire, or used as pawns in their battle. The self-righteous old fool." She paused and took a shuddering breath. "I just wish he had said something to—" "Do not touch that!" Eris hissed and leapt atop the Book of Will. Rabineau had been staring at it with rapt curiosity and had begun reaching towards it. Rabineau snapped his hand back to his chest and appraised Eris with wide eyes. "What?" he asked in alarm. Is it booby-trapped or something? Pfft, she scoffed. No, nothing like that. This book is a highly powerful magical artifact. You are not yet anywhere near ready to interact with magic of this level. One touch and you could get lost in the pages, never to find your way back out again. Why would Lynn send this to us? Rabineau asked softly. That should be obvious, Eris replied. He wanted to keep it out of Eridan's clutches. Do you have any idea what that man could do with this book in his possession? Rabineau thought about it, but it didn't take long for possibilities to surface in his mind. He could create another Raquel. Eris nodded. Yes, he could. And that would be the least of our worries. Do not forget that Linrem spent many years as a war mage. The techniques and castings he used to sow the earth in blood are also stored in these pages. What in the hell's happened? Rabineau spluttered. That is what I am trying to find out, Eris glared. If you would hurry the hells up and get in the damn buggy. Rabineau's eyes widened, and he scrambled to finish climbing into the back of the buggy. As soon as he was situated, Gareth cracked the reins, and Skippy began cantering down the road at a speed Rabineau didn't know the donkey possessed. It was not long before the twilight of the thick woods was left behind, sunlight dazzling them from the tree branches as they raced along. Eris, Rabineau asked some time later, what if Eridan is still at the chateau? Wouldn't we be bringing him the exact prize Lynn wanted to keep out of his possession? If Eridan triggered the castings that sent this book to us, Eris replied, not taking her eyes off of the road before them, then he will be lucky to be alive. Eridan is a brilliant mage, but Lynn spent decades preparing for this exact occurrence. How can you be so sure? Because I helped Lynn build the traps, Eris answered. That was a stroke of brilliance on Lynn's part. He had me construct the triggers, simply so Eridan wouldn't be able to sense them. Eridan would never let another mage assist in his workings, so it would never cross his mind that Lynn may do so, and utilizing my magic made it even more invisible. I don't understand, Rabineau frowned. Why now? After all this time? Why didn't he take the book when he took Raquel? For a moment, Eris was silent. The only sounds the rumble of the buggy as it clattered along the road, and Slippy breathing heavily as she pulled her load. Eris sighed. Lynn's Book of Will is unlike any other artifact he could have created, Eris said. He didn't set out to create a magical artifact. And, much like myself, when magic is imbued upon other items without intent or direction, unexpected things could happen. Like what? Rabineau asked. Like creating an eternal cat, for instance, Eris replied. The Book of Will has powers of its own. I find it unclear if it has a mind of its own, but it definitely is more alive than your average book. The book is alive? Rabineau asked, aghast. If you wish to put it so simply, yes, Eris said. But not like you or I. Whereas we have a life force of our own and are able to interact with the will our souls produce. The book's life force consists of incantations and precise diagrams. It usually won't move on its own, but it would always heed Lynn's call. Wait, Rabineau said. What? It heeded his call? Oh, yes, Eris said. Whenever it crossed his mind, the book would appear. Do you understand now, Rabbit? Rabineau thought about what Eris had said and compared it to the conclusions she had already drawn. Finally, he said, Aridin couldn't take the book permanently unless he killed Linram. Otherwise, Lin would simply call it back. Precisely, Eris nodded. The book knows its master. Though, now that Lin is gone, it would appear that you are the book's new master. Me? Rabineau asked in shock. But you said I shouldn't even touch that thing. Oh, you definitely shouldn't, Eris agreed. But that doesn't negate the fact that it appeared before you. Lin's magic brought it here, but if it didn't find you worthy, it likely would have vanished. Rabineau sighed and rubbed his face. A fierce headache had begun building behind his left eye, pulsing savagely. None of this makes sense, Eris. Lin's dead, and now this book I can't even touch has chosen me? What in the hells do I make of that? How in the hells is Lin dead? I don't know, Eris roared, finally turning to Rabineau for the first time since they departed the grove. There are a great many things I am ignorant to, Rabineau, and, just like you, I was not there to witness whatever tragedy befell Lin. You felt the energy as I did. The only things we can say for certain is Aridin came, they battled, and considering this book is here, we can assume that Lin has lost. Silence fell between them once more. The buggy bounced along for quite some time before Rabineau spoke again. His head was bowed, and his shoulders slumped. Eris couldn't see his face, but she was sure he was crying softly. I was finally going to hear the lamenting of the stone. Linram's study looked like a hurricane had ripped through it. The trio had spent the remainder of the short trip back to the chateau in silence, each grappling with the implications and what they would find when they arrived. Thankfully, the usual fortifications Linram employed to guard his study were drawn back, the dark oak door unlocked. The three of them had stood on the landing for what felt like an eternity as they stared at the door, no one wanting to be the one to open it. Finally, Rabineau took a deep breath and stepped forward, turning the knob and pushing the door open with a soft push. When the room was revealed, Linram's still form in a pool of crimson, Eris hissed and Gareth began uttering prayers under his breath. They stood at the threshold, looking in at the chaotic scene for a long while. When Rabineau finally steeled himself to enter and investigate the room, Eris hissed once more as he made to step in. Wait, she said. You could destroy evidence if you just walk in there haphazardly, and we need to determine all we can about what happened here. What do you suggest? Rabineau said in a muted voice. Let me go in first, she said as she stalked into the room, eyes flashing and tail held low. She circled the space first, examining the man-sized hole in the wall, the severely damaged section of wall, and the secret passage that led to the room where Linram had kept his Book of Will. She went into the small room for several long minutes before she came back out, nose to the ground, and began circling around the space once more. She paused in several spots, sniffing intensely before moving on. Finally, she closed in on Lin's body. She sat at the edge of the pool of blood, gazing at him sadly. It's okay now, she said softly. You can come in. Rabineau looked to Gareth, who had a handkerchief pressed to his mouth and tears streaming down his face. The wizened old man nodded to Rabineau, and the pair crossed the room to join Eris. Despite the twisted positioning of a limp body thrown to the floor, Linrim's face was serene and peaceful, even with specks of blood spattered on his cheeks and forehead. Gareth blew his nose into the handkerchief and then stowed it in a pocket, composing himself. He then knelt at his master's side, heedless of the cold blood now soaking into his clothes. Slowly and gently, Gareth straightened out Linrim's body, laying him flat and crossing his arms over his chest. Gareth moved to scoop up the man, sliding his hands under his knees and shoulders, but Rabineau touched him softly on the arm. "It's okay, Gareth," he said kindly. "I can take him to his room." The old manservant looked over at Rabineau, tears brimming in his eyes once more, and nodded, scooting back from Linrim and getting shakily to his feet. Rabineau stepped close and scooped up the still form of his master as Gareth had made to. He clutched Lin close to his chest, who seemed so small and feeble in death. Tears clouded his eyes as Gareth and Eris led him from the study. Several days passed in a blur for Rabineau. After taking Lin to his room, Rabineau had excused himself from the others and fled the chateau immediately. He wandered for a while, not having any particular destination in mind, or so he thought. Before he knew where his feet were taking him, Rabineau had stood once more before the boulder that Linrim had cut cleanly in half. His eyes falling on the two halves with a start, the memories of his master like a dagger stabbing into his heart. He sobbed while tears flowed down his cheeks. Walking over to the stone, he had slumped limply onto its surface, curled into a ball, and fell asleep. Rabineau awoke the next morning with his body screaming at him in pain. Boulders have never been known for being the most comfortable of sleeping spots, Rabineau had to remind himself as he extricated his sore and cramped body from the curled position he had clearly remained in all night. He groaned as he sat up and started stretching out his screaming muscles. It took several long moments of serene silence to pass before the memories from the day before came sliding back into his brain, reminding him that Linrim was gone and he was once again orphaned. Rabineau continued stretching as tears dripped from his cheeks and dropped to the stone beneath him. After stretching, Rabineau sunk into a deep meditation. He remained in that position, in that state, until Eris came to retrieve him days later. Rabbit. Rabineau was currently examining a line of ants as they left their nest and trooped along their scent-laden paths until they reached the apple tree a short distance away. They collected around the nearest fallen apple and began diligently working at breaking the massive fruit into more manageable pieces. Rabineau had been fascinated by the ants. Rabbit. The call was more persistent this time, slightly penetrating the cloud of thoughts that had obscured the inner feelings, hid away the pain, leaving only logic and a keen desire for knowledge behind. A curiosity began peeking in the back of his own thoughts as he continued to observe the line of ants, some heading back to the nest with great chunks of apple, while still more arrived at the scene. What was it about that particular noise that hid a note of truth within himself? Rabbit. There it was again. Rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. Was that him? Was he Rabbit? But he wasn't a rabbit, right? He was an ant, wasn't he? Part of the colony currently dismantling that apple. But that voice, it was so familiar, and also so incredibly irritating. Rabbit! Eris. Rabineau's eyes shot open and he took a deep, sharp inhale of breath. It took several long seconds for his eyes to focus and take in his surroundings, startling him once they did, seeing as Eris was standing in his lap, paws planted on his chest, and face near enough to his that he could feel the minute currents of her breathing against his skin. Rabineau jumped, yelping and falling backwards, nearly tumbling completely off of the stone he sat upon. Eris gave an indignant cry and leapt away from him as he flailed, righting himself. "What in the hells did you do that for?" Eris sniffed indignantly. "Me?" Rabineau scowled. "You were the one literally sticking your nose in my face." "You hadn't answered my call," she said, nonplussed. "I had to be sure you were still breathing." "So now I can't even meditate in peace?" Eris chuckled softly. "You've been meditating in peace for 3 days," she shot back. "How's that for being left alone?" Rabineau opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, the facts of her statement slapping him belatedly in the face. 3 days? He asked with a frown. "I didn't think it had been that long." "Oh, yes," Eris said haughtily. "So maybe don't be such a jackass when I come to check on you." "Well," Rabineau sputtered, "I mean—" "Besides the point," Eris interrupted tersely. "It is time." "Time?" "Yes." Rabineau paused. "Time for what?" Eris looked at Rabineau like he had just asked why fire was hot. "It is time to lay your master to rest," she said through clenched jaw, "and to observe Linram's final wishes." Oh. Rabineau felt like he had swallowed a frog, which had chosen this exact moment to fight for survival, scrambling up his throat with a painful, weighty throb. In truth, Rabineau had come to the forest to escape facing what lay before him. When his parents had died, he had been far too young to really understand what had happened, to process what it meant. Now, as he neared adulthood proper, he was forced to reckon with the loss of a loved one once more. Only this time, the loss was one Rabineau was acutely aware of. Like not knowing just how much we utilize a certain digit until it is gone, marveling in the vacuum of its absence. Rabineau simply wasn't ready to face the death of his master, his friend, his family. Eris seemed to read the young mage's thoughts, for instead of berating him for his continued silence, she simply crawled into his lap, comforting him with her weight and a small paw resting on his forearm. Together, they grieved.